Good morning. So today we're going to be talking about scheduling. And, I got to say, as a structural engineer, given my background and the types of projects that we do, I absolutely love scheduling. Yeah, it's probably because of my perception as to I can physically connect the work activities with physical objects on the ground. And so in many ways, as I see the schedule develop, I actually see the structure or the building go up. Now, that won't always be the case for some of you, depending on what your industry or type of project is. But regardless, I think scheduling, it is an essential tool, but it can be a lot of fun. It's one of those little logic puzzles that starts to come together and really starts to inform the information that you're going to need as you execute the project, both to plan it, to get it ready, to get that final baseline done, last two baselines done, to move forward, but then also to track all of the variances that are going to occur while the project itself is unfolding. So where are we starting, right? We're not starting from scratch. Project planning has been going on for a while now, and recall that we have our work breakdown structure. And if we go way back and we talked about the flow through planning, we know that the work breakdown structure is the feed in or the lead in to scheduling. And so I just throw this up for visual sake. This is a work breakdown structure tree that we talked about when we were talking about work breakdown structures. And so this is our starting point. And depending on how far we advanced our work breakdown structure, we may already have time estimates, we may already have resource estimates and everything else for the various work packages within our work breakdown structure. If we don't, we'll get there, and we'll certainly talk about how to get better time estimates and those types of things as part of scheduling. So kind of what do we need? How are we going to empower ourselves to come up with the best possible schedule, or at least a reasonable schedule that should see us through to success? And so here are a bunch of things that the process that we're going to follow. And we're going to start by identifying our precedence relationships. And by precedence, we're talking about what has to be done before something can start. So if I have an activity, I want to know every other thing that needs to be in place. And by this, I'm talking about the other work packages, not other constraints. What work packages need to be completed before this one can start? And that is going to be our precedence relationship, which is going to empower us to come up with our network diagram. So with these precedence relationships, we're going to take all of our activities and we're going to connect them in a logical way that will sequence them and allow us to visualize the flow of activities that are required in order to get through to the end of the project. Now, as we were talking about with the work breakdown structure, if we haven't already done it, we're going to have to determine the time estimates required for each of those work packages, as well as whatever costs or resources that are needed for the activity to be completed. And so those obviously are going to have an impact on our schedule, particularly if the resources are over constrained, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So with our network diagram and our time estimates for each of our work packages, and leave resources aside for now, we'll be able to figure out which of the activities are critical and which of those activities are not. And that will have an impact on how we prioritize different work through the project and in our schedule. And so finally, by using some of the tools that we're going to look at, we're going to enhance our understanding of the uncertainty associated with our schedule and be able to not just predict how long it's going to take to get through our project, that would be our critical path analysis, but what is the probability that we're going to achieve that or some other time target relative to our estimated time of completion. So there's a number of techniques or tools that we're going to look at as part of this. We're certainly going to look at a Gantt chart. And I'd be very surprised if you haven't seen a Gantt chart before. And so in my world, that becomes the center of my existence when I'm running a construction project. But we're also going to look at the critical path method. Now, the critical path method wasn't developed on the Gantt chart, but certainly in modern times, we can overlay the information coming from the critical path method onto our Gantt chart so we can get the best of both worlds, which we'll also do. And as well as the program evaluation review technique, which we talked about when we were looking at cost estimates. Well, we're going to apply that same technique to our time estimates in order to gain a probability appreciation for our work schedule. And so we'll look at all of these. And the beauty is despite the fact that they're all techniques in their own right, we'll be able to bring them all together to have a very empowered schedule. So the Gantt chart itself, for those of you that aren't familiar with it or need a quick review, it really is just a simple graphical representation of the project schedule. And so normally what you end up with is the time or the calendar shown out in a linear format along the top in the various activities of the project or work packages of the project listed down the side, and they can be grouped into subgroups or whatever. And then we just fill in when each of those activities is going to happen. And some of the things that's really great is now you have this progress visualization through time of what's being worked on when and whatnot. Now, a couple limitations of the original Gantt charts, and like I said, you will see the evolution of Gantt charts to include all of this information. The original Gantt chart didn't include precedence relationships, so you couldn't necessarily see why you had scheduled things at a certain time because those precedents were not demonstrated. And what we will do is we will take our other tools, our CPM and our PERT, and we're going to integrate those into the Gantt chart and see it in its more evolved state. So this is where we started, but it's not where we're going to end. So what about PERT and CPM? So they're both network techniques. CPM is a network technique, and we're going to look at it to determine what our critical activities are. And PERT is also a network technique at the full extension, but is first applied at each of the activities individually in order to be able to do that. So we saw back in the introductory lecture that they were both developed around the same time back in the 1950s. And while done in isolation, they really do come together nicely. And so we will teach them in isolation, but think of them and demonstrate them in their integration. So with the CPM, it considers the precedence relationships of all of these activities and all of their interdependencies to create the network of the project itself and allow us to estimate different activity times. So what do we mean by dependencies? So there really are three types of dependencies, and we're going to have to look at them in linear sequence, so we can't get confused as to what we're doing. So the first of these are causal, which is to say some physical reason why one must be done before another. So if you think of it this way, if you need to paint the walls, you can't paint the walls until you're finished the drywall. And so you have to have that physical presence of the wall ready for the paint before you can open the paint can and start painting. The example on the screen, you can't make your sandwich unless you bake the bread. And so these causal precedents have to be established through the network. And they are the first and most important ones that we're going to do. And that is what the critical path schedule is based on. It doesn't consider other dependencies. Then we will have to look at separately the resource dependencies. So particularly with over-constrained resources where you don't have enough resources to do everything at the same time, even though the causal relationships might allow it, we would then have to look at resource limitations, resource dependencies, and adjust our schedule to accommodate those as well as other efficiencies that we might want to achieve. And finally, there are discretionary schedule implications because of policy or preferences or whatnot. You may impose schedule constraints that don't fall under either causal or resource dependencies. So let's talk a little bit about, I guess, the structure of running up the PERT and CPM framework and what we're going to do to build this. So we're going to start, and of course we need to define the project and prepare the work breakdown structure. And we've already done that. And so it's really building on that work breakdown structure, which is going to allow us to build the project framework. And the first step that we have to do in order to get to the network, if you will, or the project, the framework, the schedule framework, is to develop the relationships among the activities. And those are those precedents and dependencies that we were talking about in the previous slide. With those established, we will be able to draw a network of all of the activities through our project connected with their logical precedents to get from the start of the project all the way through to the end, with everything having been completed within that network. And if you haven't already done it, we'll need to go through, and for each of those work packages, we need to know, time, cost, resources needed by each of them. So we probably started that right at the work breakdown structure when we were first doing our work breakdown structure. We wouldn't have stopped doing it, but now we're going to have to make sure that all that information is complete, because it needs to be integrated into our schedule in order to estimate the time associated with completing this network. Now, with our network, of course, what we can see is we can see all the multiple paths that have to happen in parallel or in sequence in order to get through to the end. And in looking at the path that takes the longest, we'll be able to establish our critical path, or the earliest possible time that the project will be complete is the path on that critical path. And with our network, we can now start to integrate it with our other tools, such as the Gantt chart and everything else, and use it to help plan schedule. And then ultimately, once the baseline is established, to monitor and control the project. So what does PERT and CPM give us that we wouldn't have otherwise? Why are they valuable tools? So they should, when we use them, answer some of these questions, which, as you can appreciate, are all essential questions that we're going to have to know. And that's how long is it going to take us to complete the project? When are we expecting it to be complete? We should be able to get that information out of these tools, including some estimate of the probability surrounding it or the uncertainty. What are the critical activities? And we'll need to know what those critical activities are, activities on the critical path, in order to shift our priorities when it comes to resource allocations and everything else, to make sure that we are optimizing our plan. And part of optimizing that plan is knowing which activities are critical to our completion time. And obviously, if we know what our critical activities are, we also want to know, or will now know, what our non-critical activities are, because really what they represent to us is flexibility in looking at our resources and all of the other constraints that are being imposed on our project. We want to be able to shift around our non-critical activities to try to relieve some of those constraints and leave our critical activities unhindered. So, most of this now is really from CPM, or the critical path method. Now, as we start to overlay PERT, we start to get a better appreciation of uncertainty. And so one of the things that PERT empowers us to do is to actually make calculations to determine what the probability is that the project will be completed by a certain date. And be good information to have, rather than just a single number with no feel for what its likelihood is of coming true. Now, with all of this established, of course, now what we have is an absolutely great baseline on which we can track our progress and report variance. So we can know if we're ahead of schedule or behind schedule, and because we're overlaying costs into this, we can know if we're on budget or behind budget, or whether our resources are falling short, or whether we have sufficient resources to get to the end of the project. Finally, one of the things we're going to talk about later on is crashing the project, which is to say, how can we speed it up? If there becomes an imperative to finish the project ahead of schedule, now we need to make different choices, different decisions with respect to some activities in order to try to compress the project timeline and get it finished early. And so with this network and all of the information contained in it from PERT and CPM, we can do that in a really logical and efficient way by choosing projects that can be compressed and have an impact on the overall schedule in a cost-effective way. So with that said, we have to start talking about our network diagrams and how we're going to build up our network diagrams so that we can get to all of this information and start overlaying the various techniques that we've talked about. And so we want to build up a network diagram. Now there's two kinds of network diagrams. There's the activity on arrow and the activity on node. And I'm going to use the activity on node for all of my examples where we do up a network diagram. So the activity on node basically creates a node for each of the work packages or each of the activities, and then we connect those work packages with their precedence using arrows. As compared to an activity on arrow where the arrow represents the activity. So like I say, I'm going to default to the activity on node, but wanted to make note that there are other options when it comes to drawing a network activities in case you come across them in your readings. So let's talk about the relationships then. So we have all of our nodes. So if we had a project of, sort of 10 or 15 activities, we have 10 or 15 nodes, but now we need to figure out the relationships that are going to connect those nodes. And remember that these connections, these are the causal connections. What has to be done before I can physically start my next project? Now, I believe that you don't want to do these on kind of a Gantt chart type interface, because what I have found, I have been very susceptible to imposing my scheduling bias, how I am predisposed to schedule the project in establishing my precedents when I'm doing them graphically. Whereas if I do them logically, say on a spreadsheet, working off my work breakdown structure and say, okay, what activity has to be done before this? Okay, I need to paint the walls. Oh, I need a wall. Okay. I need, do I need a floor? Well, maybe not. Depends on what floor you're on. So anyway, we can break it down to the actual logical causal dependencies, but let's look at what they look like. So in this example, we basically see 3 activities that have sequential causal dependencies. And what it says is that C can't start until B is completed, and B can't start until A is completed. And once we have established that, then we can connect those with those causal dependencies, and we end up with a linear sequence in our mini network diagram. Now we'll look at ever-growing complexities. So let's consider this diagram, and really what that diagram tells us is that we're not able to start C until both A and B are completed, but A and B don't have a relationship one relative to the other. And so the only, A and B can start whenever. However, C can't start until both of those are completed. And then this kind of just flips it around where A has no precedence, but both B and C can start once A is done, but B and C don't have a relationship relative to each other. So we just got a few more just to get a feel for it and some of the complexities you're going to see. And so this is probably our most complex we're going to look at. And so we have our 4 activities, A, B, C, and D. A and B have no precedence one relative to the other. Neither do C and D. But C and D neither can start until both A and B are completed. And that would look something like that. Now, if we took out the relationship, or if D was only constrained by B being complete before it started, so we would get rid of one of those arrows, and the network diagram would simplify a little bit down to what we see there. And then finally, we'll end with this kind of classic parallel paths through the network. So we have precedence where B can't start until A is done, C can't start until A is done. B and C are not related, but then they are both predecessors to D. And so we see this kind of parallel path through the network where we can travel ABD or ACD, and B and C can happen anytime in that parallel structure. And this is, a good, very simple form of what our ultimate network, complicated network, is probably going to look like. So what we'd like to do here is just run through a fairly quick example and talk our way through the creation of our network. Now, the one thing I will say when you're doing these by hand and drawing them out is that in the first instance, as you go through, you end up with just a mess, because the arrows overlap and they go in circles and everything else, and it just makes a mess. And in the second pass, I always kind of imagine it as if you pick up a couple of your key nodes and you kind of shake it out, and the spider web starts to make a little bit of sense, and then you lay it down nice and gently and move things around a little bit so that it looks reasonable. Now, obviously, I've already done that with this network as we see it. It's not going to be jumbled as it probably would be if you were doing it for the first time. So we have a table. It has activities labeled A through H. And in the third column, it gives the immediate predecessors. Now, we're not currently worried about the duration. That will follow on when we start looking at CPM and some other things. And so in the immediate predecessors, that's going to help allow us to draw the network. So let's start. We have two activities, both A and B, which don't have any immediate predecessors, so we can put them on our page. But we don't want to have multiple starts. We want to have a single starting point for our network. So we're going to create a dummy activity with a 0 activity time and just label it as start and make it a predecessor for both A and B. And that just allows us to apply the logic of the network and the logic of CPM and everything else by having a single start point. And so let's connect it up. And so then we look at our list of tasks and we'll just work our way down from the top. And we have C, which has a single predecessor, which is A. And so we connect it from A to C. And then we carry on. We look at D. And obviously, when I'm looking at D and I'm placing it on the page, I'm trying to place it in a spot, which is going to allow me to connect it up to its predecessors. And so it has predecessors of A and B. So if I put it down here in this spot, and put those network diagrams in, we're starting to work our way through the network. So E is our next activity. And so we place it out here and we see that it has a predecessor from C alone. So a single predecessor, we draw it in. And then we do the same thing for F, which has also got C as a predecessor. So we see now we're tearing off in parallel paths. And we go on, look at G, and G is going to have to connect to D and E, so I can put it down at the bottom and then connect it up from D and E. And our final activity has predecessors from F and G, and so we connect it there. Now, we aren't going to need a dummy activity for the finish because we do finish at a single node. So we have our network diagram from a single point to start to a single point to finish. And it's on this network diagram now that we're going to be able to apply the other techniques to figure out what our activity times are, critical path method, and everything else. So that's where we're going to close this introductory lecture. We do have a bunch more to do in scheduling. We're definitely not done scheduling, but they probably stand alone really nicely as independent packages. So we're going to take the knowledge that we've gained up until now. I'm going to record a quick video on doing the critical path method, doing the forward pass, the backward pass, and actually understanding I guess the mathematics behind the critical path. And then, that's been traditionally done on the network diagram. Then we're also going to look at how we can transfer that information onto our Gantt chart so that we can use it in our baseline from that tool, as well as some of the more advanced precedences that you may want to consider in doing your actual schedule. The other video we're going to do, again, it'll be as a separate package, is looking at PERT and looking at applying PERT to our activity times, as well as some of the probability calculations for the overall project time. And so we'll do those up as two independent videos. And with those 3 videos, we'll be ready to start going on and looking at other dependencies other than the causal ones. That will just get us through that first slice of dependencies. So hopefully that was useful to you. Don't waste too much time. We do have to get on to critical path, and that's where a lot of the fun is.